I'll open the meeting. I'll call the meeting to order and open with our land acknowledgement. On September 21st, 2022, we acknowledge that the sacred land on which this falls is now located has been a site of human activity for over 10,000 years and is rich in Indigenous history. This land is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We are grateful to the Algonquin ancestors who cared for the land and water in order that we might need here today. We're also grateful to the Algonquin people for their contribution in the making of the Rideau Canal, which runs through Smith Falls. We are mindful of broken covenants and the need to reconcile with all our relations. Together, may we care for this land and each other, drawing on the strength of a mutual history of nation building through peace and friendship, and being mindful of generations to come. I'll ask for motion for approval of the agenda. On that, I'm going to delete, let's see here, item B, housing update from AMO. The section, I think for time today, I don't think there was anything that was that relevant from that. The document that was sent out, I think it was last week, by Director Costello is more relevant. Everyone's had hopefully a chance to see that. But I'll delete that part of the agenda. I'll ask for approval of the agenda from the committee here. Moved by Vicky, seconded by Ellie. All in favor? That's approved. Thank you. Adoption of minutes. Want to have a chance to review the minutes from our August 10th meeting. Moved by Lorraine, seconded by Vicky. All in favor? Thank you. That's approved. Ask for disclosure of monetary interest. I see none. No worries there. And we have no delegations today. We do have a number of reports, priority issues. I'll start with Inclusionary Zoning report. Carl. I think Carl's joining us, or Carl is here somewhere.
You there, Carl? Do you want to move on to item C, Mayor Panko, in the interim?
Yeah, we really need Carl and Richard for item C as well.
Okay.
We skipped item E, the terms of reference discussion, and that really is a focus on our responsibilities here. So, Carrie, can you put up the
terms of reference?
Pardon?
You want me to put up the terms of reference?
17 recommendations. And
the recommendations, certainly.
All of that. Really, terms of reference relate primarily to our responsibility to do all we could to fulfill the recommendations as created by the Housing Task Force. And if you make that bigger, Carrie. There we go. Everyone can see that okay, I assume? Okay. So as we're closing on the end of this term of council and the responsibilities of this committee, we want to make sure we had a chance to review what we have accomplished and any gaps that may still be out there. So recommendation number 1, reduce parking requirements for large and or small scale projects. And of course, the new ZBL approved, zoning bylaw approved by council on August 22nd incorporates reduction in parking requirements for new multi-residential projects. The new zoning cannot retroactively require additional parking for existing development with deficient parking. So basically moving forward, the acknowledgement and understanding that we will move forward with a less parking required for multi-residential developments in areas where it's most appropriate. And certainly situations, I believe if there's a need to increase parking, planning staff would discuss with potential developer. And number 2, it's probably one of the bigger ones, is the enabling secondary dwelling units to some detached and row house dwellings as well as detached homes. And again, the new zoning bylaw approved carried forward requirements with minor tweaks to the additional residential unit requirements to further facilitate detached additional residential units. And as we discussed before, the ability for a homeowner to have a secondary unit within the main structure, as well as a secondary unit or a third unit outside as well. Number 8 is one that we didn't really get into, and I think largely the consideration that the town, as we went through the process, does not have a lot of land that would be suitable for any potential development. But that said, I think it's still something that, as we move forward, there's always a possibility the town could acquire land, and prioritizing that land for housing is something that still could be discussed. So I think with regards to that particular recommendation, I think maybe not looking at what the status of land in town is today, but consider the possibility the town could acquire more additional land in the future, as we did recently with Robinson Avenue. I'd use that example, prioritizing that for housing. So Carrie, we'll just add this back into, put an item F as a priority. We can have a brief discussion on that once we're towards the end of the meeting.
On which one, Mayor Panko?
Great.
Number 8?
Yeah.
Okay.
And 9 sort of, again, ties into that. We did look, Carl and his team did look through all the potential municipally owned land in town. We knew there was one parcel of land off of Rideau Avenue by Stephen Street that is about the only thing that could be suitable for a small development at this stage. Okay. At number 11, this is one I'm probably most hopeful for. And when we don't have the stick, we can have the carrot. And if we can provide incentives for developers to include affordable units within new development, it's going to happen through our CIP. And as it's stated here, the open house held with the draft CIP and staff feedback that's been provided to consultants to refine. Statutory public meeting for the draft CIP will be held on October 11th, and subsequent to that, in a position to consider adopting that policy. This is one I think it was a lot of work of cost to get this to this point, but this should be settled before this term of council ends. And 13, and that's something I think should probably be an annual event. We were grateful for the Tranter to provide that workshop for tenants. I've heard from numerous people since then who have viewed it after the fact online, and I think it's provided important context and understanding for people who have been at risk of eviction. And so I think this is a great effort, and Courtney and Vicky, thank you for that event. Again, I think it's something that we should consider having on an annual basis going forward. And again, basically, it's sort of the same theme with item recommendation number 14. Number 10. And so with this, again, we've often have concerns regarding the interior condition of particular units. And we had limitations that would limit us from intervening based on the details of our property standards bylaw. And Carrie, you want maybe speak a little bit more to this, but the new yards bylaw, property standards bylaw, is presented for public feedback, and these other additional items which are included. Carrie, do you want to add a little bit more to that?
Sure. So as all of you will recall, we wanted to look at having landlords be more accountable for their properties. And this was something that Linda Tranter and I also had a discussion offline about some of the things that we could incorporate into our property standards bylaw. Two of the big things were things like insects and mold and vermin and items like that the health unit doesn't regulate anymore. So it's kind of been downloaded or delegated to municipalities if they choose to incorporate things like that in their property standards bylaw. So that was something that has been, unfortunately, it has been a pretty consistent item we've dealt with under property standards. And currently as it stands, we really don't have a mechanism to address it. It's considered from the health unit standards, things like that are considered a nuisance. And not really a health item for them to deal with. So our new bylaw, we've incorporated those provisions And we've also added, we have 2 full-time bylaw enforcement officers now instead of contracting it out, which gives us more strength, I guess, to regulate not just parking bylaw, but to really have somebody dig in with property standards. So we also, the other avenue we went with property standards is, if you've read in the newspapers, as council also is considering naturalized yards. So those were the 2 big items that we had Dillon Consulting look at when we're updating the property standards bylaw. Now, I'm saying that, but we've included the naturalized yards provision as part of the new yards bylaw instead of the property standards bylaw. So I sent them both out to all of you yesterday, and they've also been on Speak Up Smiths Falls for feedback. We held a public meeting on September the 8th and got some feedback, which was great. And we're still accepting feedback because this does impact not just people who own properties and live in the properties they own, but for landlords as well. And I know that Ellie, you had provided some feedback, not to put you on the spot, but you had provided me some feedback this morning on the bylaw. If you don't mind, if you could relay your message to the group.
Hi, yeah, for sure. My comment just was in regards to, the vermin or mold, what kind of supports we can offer to the landlord to kind of support this. My example that I had given to Carrie was, I've worked in the instance where the landlord was willing and happy to, there was cockroaches and they were happy to kind of get somebody in for an extermination. But the tenant needs to move out for 2-3 days. And the landlord just wasn't able financially to provide a motel or a hotel for them. And these tenants didn't have family or friends that they could go stay with. Especially they had, a couple cats and kind of what that looked like. So, it's a sticky situation. The landlord's trying his best. It is a big expense, and they do have to move out for 2-3 days. And, I think from my perspective is it can cause a real point of contention between your landlord and your tenant, which is not really something you want. In the instance we worked with the county and they were able to use the tenants were able to use their HOPS money. Which, was really lucky that they didn't have to use their HOPS money for anything else that year. So they were happy to do that. And we were able to support the landlord. And, we're looking at 3 years later, they're still living there happy and content with a positive relationship. So, I was wondering, are there ways in which we can, support that landlord so that it doesn't become kind of a sticking point? Because at the end of the day, yes, it's the landlord's responsibility. But I think we have to acknowledge it's a big ask. It's a big financial, right? To not only have an exterminator come in, it's a couple $100 and then to put them in a motel and kind of what can we do to kind of mitigate that?
So and it's a great point. We've actually had it. We've had issues. We've been lucky so far where we haven't been able to put any property standards orders on a property because of cockroaches, but we've had a landlord who had another unit they could put the tenant in. In this instance, the new unit they went in also started to fill up with cockroaches because they were respectfully, they were kind of the issue why the cockroaches were coming in to begin with. So right as it's written right now, I don't know how we would write something in, or if it would be maybe a way that we educate bylaw enforcement officers to deal with these situations. But it's a great point and something that we're going to have to look at when, if we have to put an order on a landlord on what they can potentially do with their tenant. So it's a point well taken. I'm going to have to give that one some thought, maybe reach out to Linda Tranter as well, or even Ellie, if you have any suggestions, I'd love to take those as well. Maybe as a standard operating procedure for our officers when they're dealing with one.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good point to Carrie. Like a lot, the unit that I was referring to was a duplex, so just kind of both sets of tenants moved out. But when you do have a situation where, there's 8 units in a building, like all 8 units have to be done, or cockroaches just keep coming.
Yeah.
Right. So that is a big ask to exterminate an entire 8-unit building, and pay for residents for 8 different sets of tenants, right? So I mean, I'm not sure how we can help with that. I don't have any ideas off the top of my head, but I
Always
think
of being a landlord.
Yeah.
No, but I think it's something we could definitely, look at and discuss it, standard operating procedure, maybe a softer means of enforcement, especially if they do have to look at rehoming families for on a temporary basis, or it's just, I think it's going to be the way we deal with it, or maybe a standing operating procedure. But it's a great point, because once you have an infestation of cockroaches or something, like you said, if you've got 8 units and you've got nowhere to put everybody, that's a huge expense. So it's a point well taken. I don't know what the solution is. I don't know if there is a perfect solution, but I think we have to have some mechanism to be able to work with the property owner.
Well, and maybe part of it's the public education piece of it. And I'm sure there likely is literature out there on things that tenants can do to try and ensure that cockroaches and other vermin are not attracted to their units, and maybe try to get maybe upstream and try to prevent it from happening before it does get into a major infestation.
Yeah.
But anyway, I thanks for your comments and Carrie. So I think there is more work to do here without a doubt. Vicky?
Comment on it. Thank you. Sorry. I myself, in the past, when I first moved out of my parents, I ended up in housing, and oh boy, it was in the middle of downtown Ottawa, and the entire building had bed bugs. I ended up leaving with not even the clothes on my back. I went and bought new clothes the second I left, because it was devastating. You lost everything. You didn't want to take anything. It hurts your mental health. Makes you embarrassed. It's embarrassing even admitting this publicly, but hey, I'm okay now. My point is, though, I wonder if we could somehow implement with the CIP, not to be a pain in the arse, but kind of scoot that in there. If there's any way we need some relief financially, if we could use the CIP funding for that, or if we could even approach, I don't know if Service Master does bug removal or anything like that, but a company like that, if they would be willing to work with the town at a reduced rate, knowing that it wouldn't be like a complete ongoing issue, it would just be on an as needed basis, that would be something to explore. And I think a public education piece coupled in with the tenants' rights would be amazing. I have tons of tips and tricks on how to not mitigate, but like keep them at bay. And I know different products, different people have better knowledge on that. So I think that's something to explore as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky. Okay, moving on. Item 16, working with the county. And I think we've, as indicated, there has been stakeholder engagement, but there is also a much broader housing strategy created by the county, largely a result of discussions. I think it was the 2020 budget discussions and housing rising to the prominence. So that those are ongoing. There's no question that is ongoing. And moving on. Carl, you there? A few here you can probably speak to now.
Hello, I am here. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so you want to speak a little bit about the zoning bylaw changes and the impact that we hope can have on more affordable housing with these recommendations.
Certainly. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. The zoning bylaw, the review and refurbishment of our zoning policies was intended at the end of the day to create more opportunity for increased housing flexibility, and that's sort of where some of those policies came in, and I was actually happy to see that a few of them already aligned with what Lanark County was proposing. So for instance, with the additional residential units, that's a policy that was already adopted by council, having been reviewed by this committee last December. The final zoning bylaw actually amended the additional residential unit policies to actually further enable the make it easier to construct attached residential units in backyards by pre-zoning lands along collector roads to accommodate residential development or to accommodate a higher density of residential development as well. We're intending and hoping that that residents on higher traffic routes in areas that are currently or previously only zoned for single detached residential have the opportunity to build semis, triplexes, those sorts of medium density housing that's more compatible in a neighborhood. And by creating pre-zoning those properties, that allows that sort of development to happen easier without the need for a zoning amendment or to go through a planning process. I think there are certainly a number of other changes intended to accommodate and broaden flexible residential development within our downtown core. I think there we had to work with the official plan policies that really recognize the importance and primacy of commercial development in our downtown core. But the official plan did allow us a little bit of interpretation, a little bit of wiggle room to accommodate residential intensification in the shoulder areas, as well as ground floor residential at the rear of not street facing, but sort of at the rear and side of downtown commercial buildings. So all of that ultimately is intended to facilitate the creation of rental housing units, especially downtown, where there's a lot more amenities that are within walking distance. Parking requirements for new development by and large was reduced to one space per unit, with a threshold for visitor parking for larger multi-residential development. Through zoning, we can't retroactively require the provision of parking in existing developments. If existing residential units don't have dedicated parking, we can't step in and require them to provide that now, but we can obviously through new developments look at mandating the required parking, while also potentially reducing situations where there's more parking provided or more parking required than is really needed. And this is certainly what we've consistent with the conversations I've had with the development community, and gives a little bit more flexibility for increased residential density. So we've refurbished some of the zones. Ultimately, we allow fourplexes now in our R2 zone, which gives a little bit more flexibility for residential types in our more established residential neighborhoods, and also tweaked some of the setback and lot coverage provisions within all of our zoning categories. So through this, we're hopeful that we provide additional options for housing, and especially rental housing as of right, avoiding the need for as many minor variances or zoning applications, which would allow that sort of development to proceed a little bit quicker. But that's ultimately what we've attempted to achieve through the zoning bylaw update.
Excellent. Thanks, Carl. Moving down, Carrie, I think that covered probably 4, 5, 6. Going to recommendation 15. And develop a partnership with not-for-profit organizations. And I guess that really, I think this is probably the most meaningful action and recommendation. And it really helps solidify the relationship with Carebridge Community Support and help lead to the development of a new project at 44 Chamber Street. And on that, site plan approval was signed off this week, I think just yesterday. And official groundbreaking will be happening next Monday. So that project will soon be underway. And I know it'll likely be a year before occupancy happens, but it's still very encouraging when we know there will be like 30 units total within that development. And In addition to that, you may all be aware as well, but the town has entered into a memorandum of understanding with Carebridge for the future development of the lands on Robinson Avenue that were vacated by fire. I guess fire destroyed the buildings a number of years ago. And so that will be an opportunity for a second project with Carebridge in Smiths Falls in the coming years. And then further to that, of course, is the 5-unit development at 188 Chambers, which I think Lindsay is quite involved with, but certainly a partnership with the county for that land. So I think there's been some strides made and some progress made on that front. And then Carl actually spoke really to recommendation number 7. And also just going back to Carebridge for a moment, sorry, I'm remiss. You will all notice that Jeff Mills is not here today. And of course, Jeff was a representative from Carebridge, involved with heavily involved with the task force, have great involvement with the advisory committee. It was he and Rob Eads who actually initiated a discussion, a meeting back in the summer of 2019 between Carebridge and all the municipalities in Atlantic County that ultimately led to the development happening at 44 Chambers. So we really appreciate Jeff's leadership, sense of purpose and passion, and everything he did to try and help improve the housing situation within our community in his role on this advisory committee. And so number 7, sort of looked after. I think that's the additional residential unit is completed. Carl, is that for distribution yet?
It is ready for distribution. I'm not sure that it has yet been distributed. So I will verify where the status of that. So we actually one of the last actions of our summer student actually was to update the ARU guide, because the final zoning bylaw actually accommodated a couple of tweaks to further facilitate the detached ARUs. So we've had to update the guide to complete that. So I'll check in where that's at. I know our website is under construction at the moment, so it wouldn't have its obvious home right there, but certainly it's available for anybody who wants it, and we can check to see if there's any ways we can proactively make it available in the interim before our website's fully operational.
Perfect. Perhaps you can just distribute it to this group so everyone has a chance to see it as well. Okay. So we've got a review covered. Any additional questions or comments before we move on to the next agenda item? Yes, Vicki?
Just curious, a few members have asked, including myself, if there's any way we can, after this group is completed its term, if we could continue it on in some sort of permanent format.
Yes. So to that, Vicki, we're trying to determine what structure we use to basically, in my mind, encompass diversity, equity, inclusion, housing, food security, poverty reduction, all into some type of committee. So I would say there'll be a role for housing advocacy for the next term of council, assuming the next term of council approves it. Okay, moving on to in our agenda, item A, inclusionary zoning report. Back to you, Carl.
Thank you, and my apologies for earlier and stepping in a little bit later, and we had a couple of technical issues as well. But I'm actually going to turn that over to our planner one, Richard Grant. He's done some research on inclusionary zoning following the last. Following that discussion at the Housing Advisory Committee, and he's prepared a little bit of a presentation. So, and firstly, if you haven't met Richard, he's joins the town's planning department from the University of Waterloo's Masters of Urban Planning program. So he's been with the town for a little over a month, and we're happy to have him here. And Richard, if you can present on inclusionary zoning.
Hello, everyone. Are we all familiar with inclusionary zoning? I don't necessarily want to repeat myself if you're familiar with it.
I think so. We've had discussions on it in the past.
Okay, sweet. So I think the question from last recall was we were trying to identify if inclusionary zoning would be applicable to Smith Falls, right?
Mhm.
And based on my preliminary research, what I've discovered is that inclusionary zoning, one of the requirements is that they needed to be done in protected music transports, transit station areas, or in development permit systems that were permitted by the Ministry of Housing Affairs. So protected major transit station areas are areas that are approximately 500 to 800 meters in radius of a transit station, so representing a 10-minute walk. So the intent is that when you have a protected major transit station area, you're trying to use the benefits of transit as well as the population density to create this sort of density that you would need for inclusionary zoning. So the intent behind the Planning Act or the requirements of the Planning Act is to have a certain number of people living in a certain area, and inclusionary zoning would be benefited from that. Now, reflecting it back to Smith Falls, where you don't exactly have the population that could support having the transit infrastructure at this point. So that's one of the issues when it comes to implementing the situation, is that we necessarily could benefit from inclusionary zoning by having certain incentives for developers. But because of the requirements put down by the Planning Act, we may not exactly qualify.
Okay.
I see a question from Vicky.
Yeah, Vicky, go ahead.
Thank you. Just to be clear, it's just so I understand 100%, so I don't bring this up again, because I know I'm a pain. So we need like a 10-minute walking distance, essentially, for a transit system. It would have to be essentially a major transit system. It couldn't just be like a school bus hauling people around from A to B.
Yeah, so there are actually different density targets for what we would consider a major transit area. So for instance, you'd need to be close to a subway, and you'd need to have 200 residents and jobs combined per hectare for, say, subway. And another example would be having 160 residents and jobs combined per hectare for a light rail transit system. Or you'd have to have the same number for a GO Transit network. And it becomes a bit complicated when you're trying to include those components for a small area.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Additional comments or questions? So Richard, I guess you really confirm that as a small urban municipality without any form of public transit, it does create a barrier today. Now, I know there is a new, AMO's put out a increase in preserving purpose-built rental housing, the need for Ontario strategy.
Yes.
And within that, I believe I'm trying to find a section here, but there is a recommendation that the province expand the opportunities for municipalities to bring in an inclusionary zoning bylaw. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
It's page 16, if I'm not mistaken.
Page 6. Okay. So I don't know if you have that handy. If you can pull that.
I have it handy. I can pull it out if you'd like.
Okay.
So essentially on that section, they're talking about amending the Planning Act as well as the regulations for Ontario that would allow smaller municipalities to have a streamlined process for approving subdivisions. To make it much easier to apply for a development permit system. That would be part of the requirements needed to apply for inclusionary zoning. So it would bypass the need for having a transit system, because then you'd be easier to apply for a permanent development system that's required for inclusionary zoning.
Okay. So it raises a question. I just want to open the floor for questions and comments surrounding that. But so AMO this just came out in August. Oh no, this one's February. Sorry, this one's February. If we want to add our support to Amy's recommendation for the policy amend the Planning Act to allow this to happen?
I think the recommendation would be good, despite the fact that we're not necessarily a rural community. I think we have some elements of rurality that kind of go in line with the Roma's report.
Carl?
My recommendation to the committee, if if the committee is of the same mind, is that that your resolution be broader to also include not just the Planning Act and change those requirements, but the Ontario regulations that really bring to life the sort of scope and scale of inclusionary zoning that's viewed as a tool right now. So I think as the inclusionary zoning tool is described as Richard identified in his report, is probably outside of, probably well beyond what would be something even remotely close to qualifying in Smith Falls. But I think if the overall planning tool were to be properly scoped to be more inclusive of smaller communities that don't have the protected transit stations, and look at different ways of identifying density or other sort of criteria by which we would consider an inclusionary zoning where that would be appropriate. I think that's part of a bigger picture analysis that's beyond just the Planning Act amendments, but the broader amendment to sort of look at how we can be inclusive in that regard for a community of this size.
Great comment, Carl. Joanne?
I think that's what I was going to say. Is there any way that we can ask for some changes to the policy to meet a small community? And Carl just said it, that we can probably challenge it, right? Like I put forward.
Yeah, to that effect, I guess what we can do today is if we can have simply agreement that we would like staff to develop a framework and recommendation to bring to council to make the request that the province make the necessary changes that could enable inclusionary zoning for small rural municipalities that don't have public transit, and frame some conditions around that where we think it could be or could not be appropriate. Does that sound like a reasonable action? I know that's pretty broad and not very specific, but I think it just, if we can ask staff to carry it forward and bring it forward to a committee of the whole for discussion with either this council or probably the next council. Okay, there, thank you. Okay, thanks, Richard.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on, get back to my agenda here. So the Leonard County tools to support affordable housing next steps. And Carrie, did you have that PowerPoint handy to throw up?
I do. Bring it right up.
So as I mentioned earlier, the county had embarked, and I think you're all familiar with a deep study, as well as a report bringing in numerous recommendations, municipal tools to support affordable housing, next steps. This came back to county in committee of the whole, community services committee back in August. And there's a number of recommendations in here, but I'm going to have, as we go through it, Carl, if you can address any ideas, anything new here that we may want to take a look at in the future, or should bring into practice in the future. So there's 44 recommended actions, a variety of things here, and we don't have the full report in front of us, of course, so there's a lot of numbers which don't mean anything here at this very moment. But Carl, can you speak to basically the scope of what we have here in front of us right now?
Yes, so I can. So most of these recommendations pertain to proposed amendments to the county's Sustainable Communities Official Plan. So that the county's official plan is not directly applicable to Smith Falls as we're a separated municipality, but it's a very high level. It's a high level policy document that provides some strategic and planning direction for local municipalities that are within politically within the county. So that would include Carleton Place, Perth, Mississippi Mills, and the surrounding rural municipalities. But what these recommendations, and I did have the opportunity to look through the SHS report, and the recommendations and suggested policies they're very broad, but they're essentially opening the door and recommending that local municipalities identify housing related targets, identify housing related definitions, and as well as certain tools that can be addressed through the planning process. Some of those we already have in our 2016 official plan. Some of them we don't. But as I'd stated earlier, the drawback we were a little through the zoning review. We were a little bit constrained in terms of developing housing policies, especially in the downtown core, based on how the current official plan is organized. So and I know that one of the policy recommendations that the county is making is that local official plans go a little bit further in that direction. But at the end of the day, that's something that we would need to look at through a review and update of our current official plan. So we weren't able to implement all of these through the zoning bylaw, but there are higher level recommendations within the county's official plan for us to sort of identify and proceed and go beyond sort of the minimal language that exists in a lot of planning documents that were approved in the last 15, 20 years.
Thank you. Next page. So intensification really with more rows and multis and rental units, affordable. Carl, I guess, can you speak maybe broadly about housing development we are seeing in town now and how it fits within the summary of their summary of housing targets?
The last few years have been certainly quite interesting in Smith Falls. Our current official plan, written at a time where there's been virtually no multi-residential development for the previous couple of decades, was envisioning a fairly aggressive target of 45% of new housing development being multi-residential development or something higher density than singles. And that was aggressive back in 2016 when it was first contemplated. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but within the last couple of years, it's fair to say that when looking at rows and multis, we've not seen a significant number of single detached housing built. We haven't seen that sort of urban sprawl, I guess, if you can call it that's existed in some other communities. So I would suggest that well higher than 30% and perhaps closer to 70 or 80% have been rows and multis within the last 4 or 5 years. Similarly, with respect to rental, I would suggest that probably more than half of housing units created in the town have been rental, and that's largely based on a couple of larger developments we've seen, such as Settlers Square, the Lapine development that's now underway, and a few others. And target by affordability, unfortunately, we don't have that information. It is likely lower than that 25%, and that's certainly somewhere where we do need to zero in on. Certainly, if we were to look at enshrining these sorts of targets within our own planning documents, and that's where, say, the community improvement plan or other tools that really shine a light on and provide incentives and supports for that sort of development that will hopefully get us closer to that 25%. I think it's fair to say that most of the rentals that we have been seeing, the row houses have largely been in a couple of developments, Bellamy Farm certainly, but a couple of others in town. But they likely would not be meeting a rental threshold that's identified here. So I think that last item is certainly something that we would have a closer look at in terms of targeting policies and looking at how do we implement and achieve that goal.
Well, thanks, Carl. And I guess a lot of the recommendations that we have worked our way through, including the CIP and the partnerships and everything else, I guess, are designed to create more affordable housing without actually having a goal in mind. And 25%, I think it'd be great to see it. And it's a matter of, as you've said, it's having the incentives in place and the policies in place that hopefully can encourage that to happen outside of an inclusionary zoning bylaw, which we of course have discussed already. Lorraine.
No, I would just, this is interesting for sure. I'm thinking right now, I mean, we've had a lot of new builds in the term of, even in the last 3 years, we've had a lot of housing built, but I wasn't thinking there's 25% of what we've built is affordable. Like, I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure where we're getting at. Is that something that we're hoping for?
Yeah, that'd be the county's objective across the county with it.
But I have a sense that that's not true in our town at this point in time.
No, it isn't. You're right. And outside of the 30 units that Carebridge is putting in, the 5 units that are putting in by Lanark County Housing, let's say that's 35, but there's additional half a dozen, I believe, Carl, in a couple of other developments which were designated affordable. But and across the county, I think these are, other than the Lanark County Housing development in Carlton Place, which is 20 units, and I think a new 12 units that's been approved or in the works for Almont. That's it. So across the county, there may be 1 or 2 units in Perth, but it's a very, very few units which would be considered affordable. And if you think of it, if the goal is 130 a year, that's considerable.
I guess if I could add one more thing, I know that in my neighborhood and in some of the older neighborhoods that have apartments being added to old buildings, you know, different leveled apartments, I don't see, when I ask about rental prices, I don't see them affordable either. So maybe the CIP and the other things that we're trying to implement will help that. I hope so, because yeah, it's we need a lot of people need an affordable place to live.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Next slide. And that, Carl, continue on, I guess.
Yep. So recommendation number 15, we've actually we've achieved that. We've updated our official plan and our zoning requirements to accommodate the additional residential units. And further to Councillor Allen's point, I think that opens the door for potential more affordable units, but we certainly don't through the planning approvals process as it stands, we don't know what the rents are. We don't gatekeep on any of that. So there's no way of verifying it, and certainly those policies are intended to enable that supply, and hopefully with that supply being enabled, that would put positive pressure on creating affordable units. But again, it's not something through zoning. We cannot require an additional. We cannot speak to price points through a zoning policy, but at least it enables the development of that supply, and that is the community improvement plan. The proposed CIP is also looking at providing incentives for creating additional residential units as well. So there is a proposal for funding, and certainly those will be decisions that council will be making on a yearly basis, how much money we want to set aside for supporting the creation of these units, as well as accessible units. And the second point there is with respect to lots that are partially or unserviced, that isn't applicable in Smith Falls, but I see that there is that recommendation for creating a guide for additional residential units to make it consistent across the county. We've done ours. I haven't seen others, but certainly if there's an attempt at creating a countywide guide, I'd be happy to help out and provide ours as potentially a reference.
Thank you. Next slide. Oh, we've pretty much spoken that already, Carl. Okay, next slide. Probably it. Yeah, so I think overall, the effort of our collective effort, and I say a lot of it is Carl and his team and Carrie and the staff, as well as consultants, have hoped what we've accomplished over the term of the Housing Task Force and Housing Advisory Committee is the foundation of opportunity for the future to develop more affordable housing. And largely, I think what has been considered elsewhere is in place or soon will be in place here. And outside of having, say, a requirement to force developers to include affordable housing, the best we can hope for is to enable it through all the policy changes we've made and to incentivize it through the CIP. Okay, any further comments or questions before we move on? I don't see any hands up, I don't believe. Okay. And I skipped ahead and did the strategy, the follow-up on the recommendations, and then the terms of reference discussion, I guess, is sort of the final piece here before we go back to the previous item we added from the earlier discussion. Curious, so do you want to throw up the terms of reference now?
Sure.
Okay, so I think everyone's probably fairly familiar with this. And as you scroll through, we discussed the recommendations and the effort that we've made. I guess in the end, the measurement of the results may take years or potentially decades to unfold. And I guess we can all hopefully have the satisfaction years from now looking back, knowing that there has been more affordable housing created within our community as a result of the collective effort that everybody here has made. And I would say the investment that the municipality has made as well. And even the creation of the affordable housing CIP has a fairly significant dollar take attached to it, but council made that commitment that this is a priority and that we would fund that. So I don't know if there's more we need to go through here on the deliverables. To Vicky's point earlier, I think there's a role of advocacy going forward in the future. I don't think there's gonna be a need to delve into other potential opportunities, but a different committee, should other opportunities arise, should other concepts arise, or if different opportunities arise for the federal provincial government for incentives and things like that, we'll have a sounding board to run that through in support of council. So I think overall, when it comes to the terms of reference, I think we can recognize that for the most part, with the exception of a couple minor things, that we have accomplished what we set out to do, at least from a policy standpoint and from a development of a CIP standpoint. And as I said, in the end, it may take years before we can actually see the results of this collective effort. And as this term of council will expire later this fall, I'm sure the date, Carrie, November
14th is the last day, and the inaugural meeting is on the 15th.
Okay. So I don't know if we have a need for this group to meet again before the end of this term. I suspect we probably don't, unless something comes up that we're not, that's not on our radar today that we want to discuss. But so in all probability will be our last meeting. Any other comments on or questions related to our terms of reference? Okay, so I'm just going to circle back to our last item, which we added earlier from the recommendations, and that was basically the development of a town policy related to the use of any municipal land and prioritizing housing for that. Carrie, just throw that back up, please, if you don't mind.
Oh, the terms of reference?
No, the recommendations, and there's number 8.
Oh, okay. It's coming.
Okay. Okay. So discussion here, essentially, would we like council to consider amending our municipal land sale bylaw to prioritize housing as a criteria in the considering the sale of municipal land? And of course, that would all be on the premise that it is residentially zoned land, and Carl, maybe you can speak to that, because certain lands would fall that we may own that were being zoned industrial with our official plan, other land may be commercial. So we want to make sure that it relates to appropriately zoned land within both our zoning bylaw and our official plan. But I open the floor up for discussion and suggestions here. Vicki?
Is it possible to rezone it if we needed to?
I would say yes, depending, but let's have Carl speak to that.
I guess thank you for the question, Vicki. It's certainly council ultimately has the ability to rezone any property it sees fit, but there's certain criteria that must be met according to the official plan requirements. So, for instance, if this were in an industrial park, if it was vacant lands within an industrial park, then the official plan would have certain policies. Certainly directing employment lands to that area, as well as looking for certain separation distances between residential and uses that would create that shouldn't be near residential uses. So that's so there is always that ability to rezone. And as an example, a couple of years ago, when we sold the land on Frere that was eventually purchased by Kevlar Developments, that had commercial zoning at the time, but based on our assessment and the review of the zoning application, we felt that residential development was also appropriate, as that was in a transition area between a commercial core and a residential neighborhood. It was surrounded by residential uses. It was serviceable and accessible to a main road, so it met the criteria that our official plan suggested for residential development. That and those are reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So I would imagine that any that an updated policy would have some sort of screening criteria with respect to the appropriateness for residential development. So, for instance, we wouldn't want to see a residential development in a business park, as they would not, as those residents would be certainly far away from, likely not within walking distance of other amenities or services, and potentially they'd be isolated there as well. So criteria and appropriateness is one thing to consider, and we look at that on a case-by-case basis. So it made sense on Ferreira Drive for Kevlar, but it may not make sense everywhere else. But I think it certainly it's very valid for us to at least identify that in situations where residential development is potentially appropriate and can be supported, then it is supported by the municipality, and that gives staff as well as developers and proponents a little bit more certainty if they were to engage in that process and make an attempt to rezone.
Thanks, Carl.
I hope that answers your question, Vicki.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, any other thoughts here? So I'll throw the question. Would the committee like to recommend that council consider amending our land sale bylaw and implementing policies to prioritize housing as stated here in recommendation number 8?
Can you repeat that, Mayor Panko?
Sorry. Yeah. So would the committee basically endorse recommendation number 8? We would like to see that forwarded to council for its consideration. Anyone want to move that? Lorraine, seconded by Vicky. Okay, all in favor? I assume we have all hands up. Okay, thank you. Okay, that's it for the agenda. Potentially, that's it for a Housing Advisory Committee. Before we wrap up, is there anyone have any other questions or comments they'd like to make? Yes, Carrie?
Just one, Mayor Panko, just procedurally, the terms of reference indicate that a final report would be brought forward to council, so we can prepare that, and it would basically be most of this sheet we're looking at with the recommendations to update council on where we're at. And of course, when that happens and when the report's ready, it will be shared with all of you, and all the credentials for the meeting as well, so that you can listen to any of the council discussion that's taking place. So stay tuned for that. So I'm not going to lose your email address quite yet.
Thank you. Vicky?
I really appreciate everybody's insight on this. Appreciate everybody's guidance, and not cool with me when I lost my cool a few times. I'm really proud of what we've all achieved together, and I do feel like we have made a difference in the future of Smiths Falls in terms of either housing and affordability, or at least both. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky. And your comments were always appreciated. Your passion. Anyone else? Okay. Well, oh, Carl, go. Yeah.
Brad, I just wanted to say a quick note of thank you as well. It's been an absolute pleasure working with all of you, and certainly you've asked me good questions and tough questions, and I think we have a lot of tremendous talent around this table, and Smith Falls is very lucky to be represented by the group here, and I sincerely hope we get to work together in the future on different projects and perhaps on another committee. But I did want to express my appreciation for the guidance and direction this committee has provided. It makes our job as staff. It makes our job as staff easier when we have such an engaged and very captivating in conversation. So thank you to all.
Thank you, Carl. Well, thanks everyone. I know this has been, I don't know exactly, over a year and a half, I guess close to 2 years of we've been meeting. We had a lot of work to do, a lot of recommendations, and I appreciate the passion, the sense of purpose, the commitment. And I think from a committee standpoint, this is one which probably took on more than all of other committees. And as Carl mentioned, the knowledge and the passion to move this forward is critically important. And I think that the legacy of this group will be the results that we will see down the road, and more affordable housing, and every single unit that has someone in there that they can, every single family that has a unit they can afford, that maybe has emerged as a result of this group, is something extremely meaningful. And I don't think there's anything more important than housing. And of course, housing affordability is probably the most critical factor in all of our lives. So thank you all for your unwavering commitment and passion and purpose, and also to Carl and Carrie. I know you guys are both busy. I know the planning department has seen more planning files come through in the last few years than probably the previous decade combined, if not maybe decades combined before that. And thank you for Richard for joining our team. We're excited to have you on. I know that you're gonna have a lot of work to do, and I know you're bringing a lot of your own wisdom and passion for this. So I think the future is looking great. Doesn't mean our work is finished, doesn't mean it will ever be finished, but I think if we can at least take a pause and reflect and hope that the effort here does lead to more affordable housing for our community. Thanks everyone. At that,